Walk into any church, museum, or home in the Western world and you'll see him. The serene, pale-skinned figure with flowing blonde hair, blue eyes, and delicate features. This is the Jesus of 1,000 paintings, the Christ of Christmas cards and Sunday school illustrations. But here's the shocking truth. This image is completely historically wrong. Today, we're going on a forensic journey through time to discover what Jesus of Nazareth actually looked like. Using cutting-edge science, archaeological evidence, and historical detective work, we'll strip away 2,000 years of artistic imagination to reveal the real face of the most influential person in human history. The investigation begins with a simple but profound question. Why don't we have any physical descriptions of Jesus from people who actually knew him? The answer reveals something fascinating about the ancient world and early Christianity that most people never realize. The four Gospels, written within decades of Jesus' death by people connected to eyewitnesses, contain zero physical descriptions of him. Not his height, not his build, not his hair color, nothing. This wasn't an oversight. It was intentional. In the Greco-Roman world, physical descriptions were typically reserved for either gods or criminals. Since early Christians believed Jesus was divine, describing his human appearance might have seemed inappropriate or limiting. Jewish culture also played a role in this silence. The Hebrew Bible contains very few physical descriptions of people, focusing instead on character and actions. When the Old Testament does mention appearance, it's usually to make a theological point, like David being ruddy or Saul being tall. The absence of Jesus' physical description follows this Hebrew literary tradition, but the silence itself tells us something important. Jesus must have looked completely ordinary for his time and place. If he had been unusually tall, short, beautiful, or distinctive in any way, the Gospel writers would likely have mentioned it. Instead, we get the most telling clue of all. Judas had to identify Jesus with a kiss because he looked like everyone else in the crowd. This ordinariness is actually supported by biblical prophecy. Isaiah 53:2 describes the coming Messiah. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. The prophet was essentially saying the Messiah would be forgettable-looking, blending into any crowd. So what did an ordinary first-century Palestinian Jewish man look like? This is where modern science becomes our time machine. Forensic anthropology has revolutionized our understanding of ancient populations. By studying skeletal remains from first-century Palestine, researchers have been able to determine the typical physical characteristics of Jesus' contemporaries. The evidence is remarkably consistent. The average Jewish male of this period was about 5 feet 1 inch tall, weighed around 110 pounds, and had a muscular, compact build adapted to the demands of manual labor and walking long distances over rough terrain. These weren't the tall, lean figures of Renaissance art. Life in first-century Palestine required physical strength and endurance. Most men worked with their hands from childhood, developing the kind of wiry, practical physique that comes from constant physical activity rather than gym workouts. But the most groundbreaking work in reconstructing Jesus' appearance came in 2001, when British forensic anthropologist Richard Neve took on the challenge of creating the most scientifically accurate representation of Jesus ever attempted. Neve's work wasn't based on religious belief or artistic tradition, but on hard scientific evidence. Working with computer modeling technology and a collection of first-century Semitic skulls discovered in Israel, Neve's team used the same techniques employed to solve modern cold cases. They analyzed bone structure, muscle attachment points, and soft tissue patterns to build up a face from the skull outward. The result was shocking to many Western Christians. A broad-faced, stocky man with olive-brown skin, dark curly hair, and brown eyes. The face was weathered and strong, with the kind of features you'd expect from someone who spent most of his life outdoors in the Middle Eastern sun. This wasn't the ethereal figure of European art. This was a working man's face. Neve's reconstruction showed Jesus with typically Semitic features. a broader nose, fuller lips, and darker complexion than European depictions. The hair was short and curly, not the flowing locks of artistic tradition. The overall impression was of someone who looked distinctly Middle Eastern, which, of course, he was. Skin color provides one of the most dramatic departures from traditional Western imagery. Modern genetics and anthropological studies confirm that first-century Palestinians had olive to brown skin tones, similar to modern Middle Eastern populations. The idea of a pale-skinned Jesus comes entirely from European artists who painted Christ to look like their own people. Archaeological evidence supports this darker complexion. Ancient Palestinian clothing, jewelry, and artwork all reflect populations with Mediterranean and Middle Eastern features. Roman mosaics and frescoes from the period show local populations with consistently darker skin tones than Northern Europeans. Hair texture and style offer another area where science contradicts tradition. Genetic studies of ancient Middle Eastern populations indicate that curly or wavy hair was the norm, not straight hair. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians actually provides a clue here. He says it's disgraceful for a man to have long hair, suggesting that short hair was the cultural norm for Jewish men of the period. The flowing locks seen in Western art were inspired by Greco-Roman depictions of philosophers and gods, not by actual first-century Jewish appearance standards. Jesus, as an observant Jew, would have worn his hair according to Jewish custom, relatively short and neat. Facial hair presents an interesting puzzle. While many modern depictions show Jesus with a full beard, the historical evidence is mixed. Jewish law encouraged beard growing, and most adult Jewish men of the period wore beards. However, the style would have been much shorter and neater than the flowing beards of Byzantine art. Think more modern Middle Eastern businessman than Old Testament patriarch. Body type and build can be reconstructed from what we know about Jesus' occupation and lifestyle. The Greek word tekton, usually translated as carpenter, actually means a skilled craftsman who worked with wood, stone, and metal. In stone-rich, wood-poor Palestine, this likely meant Jesus was involved in construction work, building houses, walls, and public structures. This kind of work required significant physical strength and endurance. Jesus would have had calloused hands, muscular forearms, and the kind of practical fitness that comes from daily manual labor. He also walked everywhere, covering hundreds of miles during his ministry. This wasn't someone who spent time in libraries or synagogue studies. This was a man whose body reflected a lifetime of physical work. The working man's physique aligns with what we know about nutrition and lifestyle in first-century Palestine. The diet was simple but nutritious: bread, fish, vegetables, olive oil, and occasional meat. People were generally leaner than modern populations, with muscle definition that came from functional strength rather than aesthetic goals. Height estimates based on skeletal remains consistently show that Jesus would have been shorter than modern averages. The 5'1" estimate puts him right in the normal range for his time and region. Malnutrition and childhood diseases often stunted growth in the ancient world, making anyone over 5'6" unusually tall. Eye color provides another departure from Western artistic tradition. Brown eyes dominate Middle Eastern populations, both ancient and modern. Blue eyes, common in Northern European populations, would have been extremely rare in first-century Palestine. The blue-eyed Jesus of Western art reflects the genetic heritage of European artists, not historical accuracy. Clothing and grooming standards add important context to Jesus' appearance. As a Jewish man, he would have worn a tunic, cloak, and sandals, the standard outfit for working-class Palestinians. The garments would have been simple, practical, and probably somewhat worn from daily use and travel. Jewish grooming standards were quite specific. Men washed regularly, kept their beards trimmed, and wore their hair neat but not elaborately styled. Jesus wouldn't have looked unkempt, but neither would he have had the polished appearance of artistic depictions. Dental health in the ancient world was generally better than medieval times, but worse than modern standards. The Mediterranean diet was relatively healthy for teeth, But without modern dental care, Jesus would likely have shown some signs of wear and possibly missing teeth by age 30. Scars and marks would have been inevitable for someone who worked with tools and lived an active outdoor life. Jesus' hands would have borne the marks of his trade, calluses, small scars from tools, and the general roughening that comes from manual labor. The transformation of Jesus' image from Middle Eastern Jewish man to European figure didn't happen overnight. Early Christian art was actually quite diverse in its depictions. Byzantine mosaics show darker-skinned figures, while Coptic Christian art maintains African features. It was primarily Western European Christianity that created the blonde, blue-eyed Jesus we know today. This transformation accelerated during the Renaissance, when European artists began depicting all biblical figures as Europeans. Jesus, Mary, and the apostles were all given Northern European features, clothing, and settings. These artistic choices reflected the cultural assumption that important religious figures should look like the people viewing the art. Colonial expansion spread the European Jesus image worldwide, often displacing local artistic traditions that had depicted Christ with indigenous features. The result is that today, even in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the European Jesus remains the dominant image. But here's what's truly remarkable. When modern forensic scientists and anthropologists reconstruct Jesus' appearance using only scientific evidence, they consistently arrive at the same conclusion. Jesus looked like a typical first-century Palestinian Jewish man, olive-skinned, dark-haired, brown-eyed, and built like someone who worked with his hands. This scientific Jesus bears no resemblance to the figure in Western art, but he looks remarkably similar to modern Palestinians, Syrians, and other Middle Eastern populations. The continuity of regional genetics means that Jesus probably looked more like modern Middle Eastern men than like any European depiction. The psychological impact of these revelations can be profound. For many Western Christians, confronting the reality of Jesus' Middle Eastern appearance challenges deep-seated assumptions about race, ethnicity, and religious identity. The idea that Jesus would likely be profiled at modern airports or viewed with suspicion in many Western contexts forces uncomfortable conversations about prejudice and representation. But there's also something beautiful about recovering the historical Jesus' appearance. It reminds us that God chose to become human not as an idealized figure from European imagination, but as a specific person from a specific place and time. The incarnation wasn't about divine perfection in human form, it was about divine love expressing itself through ordinary human reality. The real Jesus, short, stocky, olive-skinned, calloused-handed, speaks to the dignity of working people, the beauty of diverse ethnicities, and the profound truth that God's love isn't limited by human categories of attractiveness or social status. Perhaps most importantly, recovering Jesus' authentic appearance reminds us that the earliest Christians were drawn to him not because of his physical beauty, but because of his teachings, character, and the transformative power of his presence. They followed a man who looked completely ordinary, but spoke with extraordinary authority about love, justice, and the kingdom of God. The silence of the gospel writers about Jesus' appearance suddenly makes perfect sense. They were telling us, without words, that what mattered wasn't how he looked, but what he said and did. In a world obsessed with physical appearance and superficial beauty, this remains a radical and challenging message. Today, as we see Jesus' face reconstructed through scientific evidence, we're not just seeing a more historically accurate depiction. We're seeing a reminder that the divine can work through the ordinary, that love transcends physical appearance, and that the most important truths about any person aren't visible to the eye. The next time you see a traditional Western depiction of Jesus, remember the real man, the Palestinian Jewish carpenter with olive skin, dark curly hair, and working hands who walked the dusty roads of first-century Palestine and changed the world forever. That Jesus, the historically real Jesus, is far more remarkable than any artistic imagination could create.